Hi, I'm Alessia, and you're about to watch a message that was preached at Calvary Fellowship in Miramar, Florida. At Calvary, we exist to help you take your next step with God. If you'd like to learn more about Calvary, make sure to download our mobile app on the App Store or Google Play Store by searching up My Calvary.
How's everybody doing? Hey, we are so glad that you're here, and we are glad that by the way, did you guys get Smarties when you came in? Who didn't get Smarties when they came in? Anybody? There you go, Frankie. You need that. You're vegan. You need that help. Anyway, who else didn't get some? All right. Oh, wow, that's such a good throw. Really good. Anyway, so the reason why we're giving out Smarties is because you're smart. That's why. Because the people that aren't getting Smarties, well, I'm not going to say they're dumb, but I am going to say that they're not smarty. So, because you could have been sitting at home watching endless news about a storm that's not coming next week, or you could be here encouraged, grow, worship, right? This is a good place to be. And so anyway, so we are glad. And by the way, let me just say that based on the Smarties you're getting, it's not much of an improvement based on what you guys have been buying, because I ran into several of you this week at the store. And let me just say, there's a lot of junk food getting purchased by you people. I went into Publix the other day to buy lettuce, because that's my life now, all right? Learn from me, all right? Just don't, anyway, so that's my life. And I saw people, seriously, guys, like how much soda can a person possibly drink? Soda, chips. Some people were buying Oreos as if the company was going out of business. And I'm like, throttle it back. Anyway, so I'm glad, but that's because some people have like hurricane rules. They think that, like the calories don't apply if there's a hurricane anywhere in the world. Sometimes we have those rules even when we go on vacation, where you have the vacation rules that are different than normal rules. And so when you're on vacation, you sleep late, you stay up late, you eat some junk food. Some of you are like, yeah, it's kind of like my normal. Anyway, come talk to me after. Anyway, but so the way it works at our house is when you turn 10 at our house, that's a big deal. And so we decided, my wife and I, that we were going to do something epic for my son Xander's 10th birthday. So what we decided to do was get him tickets to see Dude Perfect on tour. Now, how many of you know who Dude Perfect is? Okay, for those of you who don't, these are 5 guys that do like trick shots and all this. So anyway, check out this little video. It'll tell you kind of what they're about. You can check it out now.
Dude Perfect.
So I want you to imagine what a 10-year-old boy thinks of these 5 guys. They are like, these are his heroes. And so they were doing this tour where they were going to do like, these battles or contests, see who would win, and they're going to do some comedy. Anyway, so these guys have 45 million subscribers on YouTube, and they're all Christians. One of them used to be a youth pastor. Anyway, so we decided, hey, let's do something for Xander, even though they're not coming here. The closest place they're coming is Atlanta. Let's get tickets to the Atlanta show, and then he and I will fly up there. One of my best friends lives in Atlanta, and my son is tight with all of his boys, and so anyway, we'll spend the weekend up there. We'll go to the show that Sunday night, and then we'll fly home the next day. So we made that decision, and then I also got him a meet and greet, so he was going to be able to meet all 5 guys. So I decided the morning that we left, which was a Saturday morning, and I said, I'm just going to make this the most epic weekend ever for him. And what I decided I was going to do is that I wasn't going to refuse any request. As long as it wasn't something crazy like, hey, is it okay if I fly the plane? Other than that, I'm gonna say yes. So we get there, and he's like, Dad, do you think it'd be okay if I got some Cheez-Its before we, I'm like, go for it, Cheez-Its, let's do this. So he got the snacks, and then when we're on the plane, he says, Dad, when we get to Atlanta, remember that place we went to last year It was so good. Do you think when we go to Atlanta that we could go there? And I'm like, all right, that's the first place we'll go when we land. We landed, we went to rent the car, and we had all of, it was the same car, but 5 colors. I'm like, which one do you like? He's like, I like that one. And I'm like, well, then that's the one we're going to get. So anyway, now you got to understand is that at my house, typically my kids only get to drink soda on the weekends. During the week, we're North Korea. But on the weekends, things kind of loosen up. And so, but when you're to your birthday, on your birthday trip, you can drink as much soda as you want. And if you want to eat Mexican food every meal, then we eat Mexican food every meal. And that's what we did. And we had ice cream at 10 p.m. And we watched Dude Perfect on YouTube in the hotel room while eating popcorn and Oreos. And that's what you do with Vacation Rules. And then on Sunday, we went to the Dude Perfect show. And he wanted to get a shirt. He wanted to get a sweatshirt. But he didn't have enough money. He only had enough money for a shirt. So I'm like, you know what, Zan? Happy birthday. I got him the sweatshirt. And then we got in line for him to meet the guys. And so this is the picture of him meeting the guys. Now, you have to understand something about Xander. Xander is just so charming. Everyone, from the minute you meet him, everyone loves him. And I don't just say that because he's my son. Well, I do say that because he's my son, but I say that because he just is. Everyone who knows him loves him. And so the Dude Perfect guys would meet kids, and we're standing in line, and we're probably like halfway. So there've been 30, 40 kids that they've met, and they're just like, all right, man, high five. They met Xander within 3 minutes. They're hugging him, and they just love him. Like, all right, man, we love you. And anyway, it was just amazing. So then we, the next morning, so we go to the show. The next morning, I'm flipping through Instagram, and I follow Dude Perfect on Instagram because my Xander likes to know what's going on. So I'm flipping through Instagram, and this is the show from Atlanta, and I'm like, that looks so familiar. So I zoom in, and that's my son for 9.8 million people to see. And this is the picture that I took of him during the show. And he was just so, we were walking out that night. Sunday night was the show. And he says to me, he goes, Dad, today was the best day of my life. And I said, I'm like, Dad, thank you so much. Well, he says that to me. I mean, there's 10,000 people in this arena. I start crying in the middle of this arena. And I'm like, me too, buddy. Me too. I mean, I'm like crying like an idiot in front of all these people. And they're like, does this guy need medication? I'm like, yes, but for totally different reasons. Listen, now here's the thing. Last night, I didn't tell the other services this, but I'm telling you this because I like 1 o'clock better. And so I'll tell you this. Last night, where Xander and I are in the bathroom brushing our teeth. And he says to me, and he goes, Dad, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good was the Dude Perfect trip? And I said, Zan, if you're going to ask me, I'd say it was a 20. And he goes, yeah, it was a 20. It's the best trip I've ever been on in my life. And so we get home from the trip. We left Saturday, Dude Perfect's on Sunday. We get home on Monday. And he wakes up on Tuesday, goes into the kitchen, and goes to grab himself a root beer. And I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm thirsty. And I'm like, it's 9 o'clock in the morning, and you're grabbing root beer. And he's like, so? And I'm like, he's like, ah. And he realized, vacation rules are over. It's back to North Korea. And I didn't realize. I got used to the freedom. Now, the reality is vacation rules can't last forever, or you'll end up broke, unemployed, and probably with type 2 diabetes. So that's why you got to throttle it back. Now, here's the point, right? The point is that rules change. Some rules apply on vacation that don't apply at other times, even within the same family and coming from the same parents. And this is important when it comes to the Bible, because people who are critical of the Bible usually pull a random verse out of the Old Testament, bump it up against a New Testament principle, and they'll say, see, this is totally contradictory, and the book can't be trusted. The problem is, that's a very binary way to look at the Bible. And we all recognize that we as individuals are much more nuanced. And if we're nuanced, then certainly the Bible is going to be nuanced, because it's not just what the Bible is saying, but who the Bible is saying it to. And so we're in part 3 of a series that we've been calling The Bible for Grown-Ups. We're talking about not just most of us grew up hearing some stories of the Bible, but most of us did not hear the story of the Bible. And so whether you're someone, you know someone, or you are someone who's walked away from God and maybe kind of easily dismissed the Bible, it could be because you haven't heard the story of the Bible. Because once you've heard the story of it, it's kind of hard to dismiss the stories that are in it. And what we've been saying in the first couple of our messages is that the story of the Bible doesn't begin in the beginning. The story of the Bible begins at kind of the end of the middle, when the disciples of Jesus started writing accounts of Jesus' life and Jesus' resurrection, because they were eyewitnesses of what they saw. And it was the resurrection that caused them to go from fearful disciples to then fearless apostles. Because if the story of Jesus had ended at the cross, none of us would be here, because he would just be another wannabe preacher that showed up in the first century. But because something happened, that something being the resurrection, it changed human history as we know it. And that's why the gospel writers, we have 4 accounts of Jesus' life. And in that world, when writing was so expensive, it's almost unheard of to have 4 accounts of the same event. But these eyewitnesses wrote down what they saw. They began to travel throughout the Roman world, sharing the gospel, the story of Jesus with everyone. And people quickly began converting to Christianity, embracing Jesus, embracing the gospel. And most of these Christians were not Jewish. They were Gentiles. They knew nothing about the Jewish scriptures, nothing about the Jewish religion, but they got very interested in the Jewish scriptures because they got very interested in a particular Jew, that is Jesus. And so because they got interested in the Jewish scriptures, which were called at that time the law and the prophets, it was not called the Old Testament. That comes much later, and we'll talk about that later. They got interested in the law and the prophets, and they didn't see them as Jewish scriptures anymore. They saw them as Christian scriptures, because they saw these prophecies and they said, this speaks of Jesus. And they started seeing Jesus in all these prophecies. In fact, as we joked last time, and I showed you a couple places, they even started seeing Jesus in places where Jesus was not. And now, the truth be told is that sometimes they started looking and they missed something. And even now, 2 millennia later, sometimes we miss something, because we go into the Hebrew scriptures looking for God the Father, but here's what we miss. We miss God the founder. And that is God, we miss the story of God who founds a nation, redeems them, disciplines them, and ultimately sets the world up for the coming of Messiah. And if you miss this, you will simply try to pull verses out of their context, and it's like trying to have a root beer 9 a.m. when vacation rules are over. And listen, if we miss it, what we will tend to do is one of 2 things. We will tend to pull verses out of their context to say what they want, or we will try to pull verses out of their context to dismiss the Bible altogether. And so what the right approach? The right approach is for us to understand the narrative of the Bible. And once we understand the narrative of the Bible, we will have more appreciation for the Hebrew scriptures. So where does it begin? It begins here at number 1 in your outline, and that is that God established a covenant with the Hebrew people. God establishes a covenant with the Hebrew people. Specifically, God establishes a covenant with Abraham, because Abraham was literally the first Jew. The word Hebrew literally means, it's from this word Eber, which means to cross the river. And so Abraham was called in an area that's called the Chaldees, which is near Babylon, which is to the east of the Euphrates River. God calls him, and he crosses the Euphrates River to go to the land of Canaan, which ultimately would be called the land of Israel. And so that's why they called Abraham a Hebrew, because he's one who had crossed the river. Well, God calls him to this, to go to this place, and here's the promise that God gives him. It says, now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now God is making Abraham an unconditional promise. And in this unconditional promise, what that means is that God's going to do what he's promised to do, and it doesn't matter if you keep your end of the bargain. That is, it's unconditional. God's going to do it. The other type of covenant that we see in the Bible is what's called a conditional covenant, and it usually begins with the word if. And that is, God says, if you do this, then I will do that. And we're going to see that in just a few minutes when Israel gets to Mount Sinai. So Abraham gets this promise. He says that all the nation's going to be blessed through his family. He's like, I don't even have kids. Well, he ends up having a son named Isaac. Isaac has 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons and some daughters. Jacob actually has this amazing experience with God, and God changes his name from Jacob, which means deceiver, to Israel, which means governed by God. Anyway, the 11th son of Jacob is a guy by the name of Joseph. Joseph, his brothers didn't like him. He gets sent down to Egypt through an amazing story. Joseph ends up in a position of power when a famine strikes that entire region of the world. Joseph gets reunited with his family and says, listen, there's still a few years left of this famine. Let's move the whole family down to Egypt because there's grain here, and that way we can wait out the storm. So the end of the book of Genesis, the entire family, 72 people, go down to Egypt to wait out this famine. And the book of Genesis ends. When the book of Exodus opens, 400 years have passed. And now there arises, and this is in the first verse, that there arose a Pharaoh who didn't know or remember Joseph. And now the children of Israel are not 72. They're well over 1 million people strong. And he begins to oppress the people, and he enslaves the people. Now, God calls Moses to deliver the people from Pharaoh, and there are 10 plagues. Now, you got to understand this about the plagues. And sometimes we think, well, this is just arbitrary. God's flexing his muscles. No, it's not. They are very strategic plagues. Why? Because the Egyptians worshipped primarily 10 major gods. And every plague in Egypt was a judgment against the gods of the Egyptians. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile River. So you know what God does? Turns the Nile to blood to say, hey, your God is dead. They worship Ra, the sun god. You know what God does? He does a plague of darkness to say, where's Ra? I guess he's gone too. They worship the Pharaoh himself. The last plague was the death of the firstborn. The whole point being is that God is the one true God. Now, once again, I'm glossing over this very quickly because there's not a lot of time. If you are very interested in this, I would encourage you to watch the movie starring Charlton Heston as Moses and Yul Brynner as Pharaoh, which is a great movie. It's 3.5 hours, and so your house is all shuttered up anyway, so you got nothing else to do. So watch it. So anyway, they leave through a whole amazing series of circumstances, cross the Red Sea, and they cross into what's called the Sinai Peninsula. And they go to a mountain that is called Mount Sinai. This is important for us to understand because here God establishes a conditional covenant with Israel because the whole covenant is, I will, if you will follow these commands that I'm telling you, that I'm going to be your God, you will be my people, I'm going to watch over you, protect you. But he's also setting up some rules. Why? Because all that these people know is slavery. And even though he has taken them out of Egypt, it's going to take a little longer to get Egypt out of them. And critics of the Bible usually have a problem here because they'll take the commands that happened at Mount Sinai. Now, once again, if you watch the movie, you'll think, well, they just got the 10 Commandments. No, they didn't get the 10 Commandments. They got the 2 tablets of stone, the 10 Commandments, and then they got, in total, 613 laws that the children of Israel were to follow. Now, Richard Dawkins, who I like to quote once in a while, who is a very famous atheist, very unpleasant individual from what I can tell. He has, I kind of quote him because he's kind of the poster boy for the new atheist movement. And in his book, The God Delusion, he says this about Judaism. He says, Judaism, originally a tribal cult of a single, fiercely unpleasant God, morbidly obsessed with sexual restrictions and with the smell of charred flesh. Now, and he goes on to just more detail. But here's the thing. Now, understand what happens. You watch a YouTube video of that, and this guy makes his case, and then he pulls a couple of Old Testament verses out of context, and no wonder somebody's faith is shaken by that. But the thing I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is not just we have to understand not just what the Bible is saying, we have to understand who the Bible is saying it to. Remember, this is being spoken to a group of people who have only known slavery in Egypt and the power of the Egyptian gods. And they've seen God do some amazing things to free them from slavery, but now he's priming them and training them that they are going to go into a land of their own and establish a nation. But they don't know anything about establishing a nation. All they've known is 400 years of slavery, baking bricks, and building things for Pharaoh. Now, you ever see these quotes, or you see them on social media, or you see articles about these kind of silly laws that are still on the books? And this is like in America, so there'll be these laws like in California, it's illegal to eat a frog that dies during a frog jumping contest. That is a real law. That's a law that's still on the books. Sounds totally ridiculous until you realize that about 80 years ago, when the law was enacted, there was a mining town in California that had a frog jumping jubilee. And during the festival, they ate the frogs and got sick. And so the law was created to, for the sake of public health. In Alabama, there's a law that it's currently illegal to train bears to wrestle. Now, some of you are like, well, there goes my entrepreneurial idea. And so, but that's just, now you got to understand, about 150 years ago, this was a very popular sport in Alabama, but the bears were winning a little too much. And so, it's not like they were just getting pinned. I mean, they were getting mauled. And so in Alabama, they had to actually make a law for public safety to prohibit the training of bears to wrestle, and so that they would just get out of this idea. So the last one is in Carmel by the Sea, California, it's illegal to wear high heels in that city without getting a permit. Now, if you say Carmel by the Sea, why does that sound familiar? That's the city that Clint Eastwood was the mayor of for several years. Now, people make fun of this law, and it tells me that they've never seen the movie The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Hang 'em High, The Legend of Josie Wales, A Fistful of Dollars, or The Unforgiven. The whole point of all of those movies is people who mess with Clint Eastwood usually don't live. And so I grew up, listen, my stepdad loved Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson and John Wayne. And so all we did was, when we weren't working, because that's what my parents' hobby was, when they were done working, they worked more. And so if we weren't doing that, we would watch either John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, or Charles Bronson movies. Anyway, it makes me wonder why I'm not more violent when I watched all these movies. Anyway, so here's what happens in Carmel by the Sea. Carmel by the Sea has so much uneven terrain and unpaved streets that the city wants you to get a permit, because here's what they want you to do. They want you to assume the risk so that you don't twist your ankle and then try to sue the city because of, the city didn't pave the street. And so my point is this: whenever we read articles about these silly laws that are still on the books, they were all created to solve a problem. Now, once again, we talk about this stuff and laugh, but the problem is when it comes to the Old Testament laws, without context, people look at them and say, wow, it's totally obsolete. What I'm here to tell you is that the Jewish law was literally thousands of years ahead of its time. And I want to focus on one chapter for just a minute, just to kind of answer Richard Dawkins in his quote, Leviticus 18. Now, if you've ever struggled, if you ever started reading the Bible, here's usually, I've talked to so many people over the years, and here's usually how it goes. They start reading Genesis, and they're like, oh, the story is so good. And then they get to Exodus, and they're like, wow, this is so amazing what God did. And then they get to Leviticus, and that's where they stop reading the Bible. And so let me explain. And you're like, what in the world am I reading? And so what happens is, and there's something amazing here, and this is why Richard Dawkins and those that are like him, they pluck these verses out of context and they miss it. They miss the context in which it was written in, and that is, and here's number 2 in your notes, and that is this: that God was establishing a better society for his people. So let's read a few verses out of Leviticus 18. So here we go. Sorry to gross you out in the early afternoon before lunch. No one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. I am the Lord. Do not dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mom. She's your mom. Don't do that. Sorry, that's my translation. Don't have sexual relations with your father's wife. That's your stepmom, because that would dishonor your father, parenthetically, and it's gross. And now, You're saying, Pastor Bob, why are you reading me these verses? I mean, I have to eat lunch after this. Now, because here's what we miss in these laws and every other law in Leviticus 18. Leviticus 18 has 19 sexual prohibitions. What we have to understand is that every single one of these prohibitions was practiced in Egypt, and every single one of these prohibitions was practiced in the land of Canaan, in the land that they were going to possess. Once again, you read it in context, you get to the end of Leviticus 18, and here's what it says. It says, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. The Bible's already telling us this is where these people are doing. Now, here's what you got to understand. So, scholars pretty much agree that the time of the Exodus from Egypt was about 1450. So, right around there, 1450 BC was when the children of Israel got this law. Now, so let's fast forward 1,500 years. Now we're in the time of Jesus. The resurrection has already happened. The church is already beginning. In Egypt, they were still practicing all of these things. The Egyptians were still marrying their siblings. The Jewish law was thousands of years ahead of its time, and it would take the Egyptians a few more generations to walk away from that kind of behavior. And this is why it's fascinating to look at and why I want to spend a minute talking about it. Listen, today, every developed nation in the world, and most developing nations, 17 of the 19 the sexual prohibitions in Leviticus are either illegal or frowned upon. That's how far ahead of its time the Jewish law was. And that's why we can't look at the Mount Sinai covenant and say, man, it's so antiquated. I mean, how could God be so old-fashioned and narrow-minded? No. The Sinai covenant that God established with ancient Israel is a moral and civil code that, when understood in its ancient context, is absolutely brilliant. And every scholar and historian knows that you don't pull something out of its ancient context and compare it to a modern world. And listen, here's what we have to understand, is that God is a good father. Just like you want to be a good parent. And when your kids ask you a question, think about this. When your kids ask you a question, where do babies come from? What's the answer? Well, it depends on who's asking. If a 5-year-old asks, they get a certain answer. If a 12-year-old asks, they get a different answer. If a medical student asks the question, they get a different answer. If you're my kids, no matter what your age, is the same answer, which is ask your mother. But most other people. Now, but the answer, once again, so where do babies come from? Well, it depends on your age. And listen, nobody's lying. Everyone is telling the truth, but what we're doing is we give certain levels of detail depending on the capacity of the audience. At the Mount Sinai covenant, we see God creating a nation for a very specific purpose, accommodating to the maturity and the ancient times of what they knew and didn't know, and even in his willingness to accommodate for where they were. The Sinai covenant is still absolutely brilliant. And once again, even although some might say that it's unsophisticated or barbaric, it is in fact absolutely superior in every way. It's superior civilly, religiously, morally to any of the surrounding nations. In fact, the protections that were offered to the most vulnerable in that culture were nothing short of revolutionary. Under the Sinai covenant, women had more rights and were better protected. Under the Sinai covenant, servants, foreigners, children, all fared better than the counterparts did in the surrounding nations. Because as we said last week, the Hebrews understood from the very beginning that not the gods, but one God created everything. And that the creation of mankind was not an afterthought. And that now we're to worship creation. Instead, God establishes the order where now mankind is the pinnacle of creation, and they don't worship creation, they rule over creation and steward creation. And see, that's why it's a completely different thing. And listen, what we take for granted now was understood back then, and the rest of the world is finally starting to catch up. And some parts of the world haven't caught up yet to what God had said 3,500 years ago to this Hebrew nation that was coming out of slavery. And one of the many ways that Israel was to be a light to all the nations. But they ended up picking up a few bad habits along the way. And that's what leads us to number 3, and that is that God was preparing us for something new. Preparing us for something new. So Israel was led by Moses. Moses dies right before they're going to enter the promised land. Then Joshua is the judge. He's the leader of the people. Joshua dies, and then Joshua's leaders become the judges. After Joshua dies, now there's a series of judges that come up that are kind of leaders of the land, and you can read an Old Testament book. It's the 7th book in the Bible called Judges, and it'll tell you the story of all of them. That leads into a little book called Ruth, and then 1 Samuel, where you read about the last judge of Israel, whose name is Samuel. And around that time, the people start saying, we want a king. Why do you want a king? We want a king because everybody else has a king. All my friends have a king. And so why can't we have a king? And so they decide that they want a king. And for the most part, these kings are a complete disaster, because these kings start raising armies. When you start raising armies, you start raising taxes. They all had most of them had multiple wives. It's a complete mess. I mean, you think having one wife is difficult. Imagine having several. And so, by the way, the other 2 services found that funnier. Now, and one of the challenges that people have with the Bible is they'll say, well, see, the Bible condones polygamy. And once again, we did a message on this a few months ago in a series called Asking for a Friend. You can track that down. But the Bible doesn't condone polygamy. What it does is it's honest about what happened. If somebody takes 5 wives, the Bible records exactly what happened. There's no, and so took 5 wives, and then God gave him a thumbs up emoji. That's not what happens, right? It's just recording what happened. And by the way, I'll try to do justice to this quote, but Robert Alder is an Old Testament scholar. He has this great quote on the topic of polygamy, and he says that anyone who thinks that the Bible condones polygamy doesn't know how to read. Because every time someone in the Bible has multiple wives, they are having a terrible time. So anyway, I'll leave you with that. Moving on. Within 100 years of them asking for a king, the nation is split in 2. There's a northern kingdom called Israel, a southern kingdom called Judah. And prior to that, they had built a temple. Why did they want to build a temple? Because everybody's got a temple. Everybody's God. All my friends' gods have temples. Why can't we have a temple? And so David wanted to build it. He couldn't. Solomon ended up building it. But there was one difference in the Jewish temple than any of the other temples in that part of the world or anywhere in the world at that time. And that is that there was no statue or image for the God in whose honor the temple was built. Now, this is because the number 2 of the big 10 commandments was, you're not going to create any graven image or statue of me. You know, he says, I'm Yahweh, the one and only God. I cannot be contained in, described by, narrowed down to, or reduced to an image. Oh, and by the way, I don't live in this house. This is just a place for my people to worship. Now, little side note, if I can. 63 BC, there's a guy by the name of Pompey, and here's a picture of Pompeii. This is it's out. You can go see this if you go to the Louvre in Paris. You can go see a picture of a statue of a guy that looks pretty much like Rutger Hauer. And if you ever saw Blade Runner, you know who I'm talking about. So anyway, Pompey is the military leader who annexes Israel into the Roman Empire. But he's very fascinated by the Jewish people because he goes to Jerusalem and he says, I've got to see this God of the Jews who won't join the pantheon of Roman gods and who says he's the only God. So he goes into the temple, brushes by the priest, gets to the big curtain that separates the holy place from the most holy place, pushes back the curtain, goes into this room that's called the Holy of Holies. It's a 15 by 15 room. And you know what he finds? Is that it's empty. I mean, there's no, he looks around, he finds dishes, like these vessels. He finds a table. He finds like 12 loaves of bread. And he finds this candlestick. He finds some gold, but no God. And he's so confused and disgusted by what he sees that even though he's conquered the city of Jerusalem, he doesn't even take anything. He just leaves and never comes back. Because he couldn't understand the idea of a God without an image. Now, the thing that he didn't realize is that just about 70 years later, about 6 miles away in a little town called Bethlehem, God was about to make an appearance. Well, back to our story. So these kings were misbehaving. While they were misbehaving, God was sending prophets who would try to warn these kings, correct these kings, and bring the kings and the people back on track. And so when you read the Hebrew Bible, what you'll find is a lot of the text are the writings, warnings, and illustrations of these prophets. Now, what you got to understand is that most of the prophets are talking about a specific issue in a historic context. They're dealing with something about one of the kings who are being naughty about something, and they got to try to bring him back, because then as the king goes, usually is how the people go, and then they're trying to deal with either one of the kings in the northern kingdom or one of the kings in the southern kingdom. But every once in a while, one of the prophets would look beyond the immediate historic context to a future day when God was going to do something through the nation of Israel for the nations of the world. So one such prophet is a prophet by the name of Isaiah. And 600 years before the birth of Jesus, Isaiah writes these words. Maybe this sounds familiar. It says, "He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised and he was held in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions." This person was pierced. "He was crushed for our iniquities," or sins. "The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, and though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities." Now listen, this is one of many prophecies that talk about a particular person who was to come that was called the Messiah, the anointed one. That's what the word Messiah means. It means anointed one. And the word Christ is just the Greek translation of the word Messiah. It's Christos in Greek, which means anointed one. Well, now, one of the challenges that the Jewish people had is that they would read these prophecies, and some of them talked about the Messiah, as a very powerful individual, and then some of them saw him like this, that he's actually going to be pierced for other people's sins, that he's actually going to be cut off from the land of the living, but then he's going to see the light of life again, that he's actually going to be cut off, he's going to be buried with the rich, and then he's going to see the light of life again, which sounds like they're going to pierce him, which is how they're going to kill him. They're going to put him in a tomb, which is with the tomb of a rich person, and then he's going to come back to life. And if you read the Gospels, you're like, wow, that sounds super familiar. And now, once again, the Jewish people were confused, and actually sometimes they actually believed, there were some scholars who believed that there were literally two Messiahs. They thought of one as Messiah ben Joseph, that is like Joseph in the book of Genesis, and they called him the suffering servant, like we read in the book of Isaiah. The second is the one that they called Messiah ben David, and that was the conquering king. Now, as Christians, we understand that it's not two Messiahs, it's one Messiah, two visits. And Isaiah was predicting in extraordinary detail what eventually would be fulfilled 600 years later. And over in the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish people were reminded that they were a divine means to a divine end. And when it's put all together, that's what makes the story so beautiful. Now, let me say just a bit, how can you say you're a means to an end? If you want to live a meaningful life, you have to become a means to an end. And that end cannot be yourself. That's the meaning of meaningful, is that you become the means for someone else. That's just how it works. The Jewish people experienced that. They became a divine means to a divine end. The story of ancient Israel is absolutely magnificent, where God enters the messy ancient world and creates a kingdom in this world so that he could ultimately create a kingdom that is not of this world. But if we want to sand off the rough edges and be like, well, why did God act this way? And, why is he like this here? And then he's different. And we try to, listen, God's character is the same. But But we see that God is acting certain ways because there's conditional covenants and then there are unconditional covenants. We are operating in a new covenant, but now I'm getting ahead of myself. Once again, if we want to sand off the rough edges of the Old Testament, we're missing the mess that God waded into in order to see the story of redemption played out to its bloody crucify him end. The Hebrew Bible is a saga of people struggling to survive in a world where food was scarce, where enemies were real, and death was a minor infection away. And despite all of that, these people clung to Yahweh, their God. And Yahweh clung to his people, careful not to override their freedom with his presence. And listen, this entire story, it's gritty, it's powerful, it's history with a divine purpose. It's history with you and me and us in mind, with the world in mind. It's a purpose that was announced by God to Abraham 2,200 years earlier, and 2,200 years later, it was fulfilled when a Jewish carpenter discovers that his fiancée is pregnant. And then suddenly, the next part of history would be fulfilled. The fulfillment of Isaiah and other prophecies would begin. In fact, it would usher in something that would benefit the entire world. In fact, there was a time when the children of Israel had disobeyed God so much that God says, I'm kicking you out of the land for 70 years. Because that was one of the promises. It was the conditional covenant. I'll be your God if you obey me, and if you disobey me, I'm going to send you to other nations. They're going to conquer you. And for 70 years, that happens. And as they're leaving, as they're going into captivity, there's a prophet who's writing, whose name is Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is writing, he's talking to the people, and he gives this prophecy, not of the here and now, but of the what would happen in the future. And this is what he says. He says this, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with them, with their ancestors, when I took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt. Because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares. I will put my law in their mind and write it on their heart. I will be their God, and they will be my people. You see, the prophet is writing, and he says, hey, listen, there's a promise that's coming. There's a covenant that God's going to make that's not going to be like the one we made at Mount Sinai. The if you do, then I will. It's going to be an unconditional promise that God is making. And here's the thing that's amazing. It's not going to be written on stone like the one at Mount Sinai. It's going to be written on the human heart. Well, finally, the Apostle Paul, who was an expert in all things Jewish. In fact, he was part of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish Supreme Court. Through an amazing series of circumstances, he becomes a Christian, and he's writing to a group of people in a region, a group of Christians in a region called Galatia. They were primarily Gentile, and here's what he says to them. He says, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. God had put everything in place. You see, 300 years before, Alexander the Great had conquered the known world. And as Alexander conquered the known world, he had one goal in mind. Alexander was obsessed with Greek culture. And his goal, when he thought every other culture were barbarians compared to the Greeks. And so his goal was to conquer the known world and establish Greek culture. And what he did was he conquered the known world and brought the Greek language everywhere. And so by the time that Jesus was born, the entire world was speaking Greek. Well, eventually the Grecian Empire gives way to the Roman Empire. And when the Romans take over, the Romans had this kind of way of building roads. And the Romans had this belief that no matter where you lived in the empire, you could get on a road and you could find your way to the headquarters, to the capital city of Rome, and get justice if you needed justice. And that's why, hence the saying that all roads lead to Rome, because in the ancient world, all roads did. And it was in that world that Jesus was born into. It was in that world that Jesus was crucified. It is in that world that Jesus rose from the dead and the New Testament writers began to write. And they were able to write in a common language that everyone was speaking, and they were able to get on roads that everyone was walking and go everywhere and preach the gospel. And so the law of the Jewish people served a huge role, not just for the Jews, but for all people. It showed us what God's standard is and that we fall short, and why we need a Savior in the first place who could be the fulfillment of every requirement of the law on our behalf. So by the end of the 2nd century, the Gentile church, who still didn't have a Bible of their own, they had Gospels that had been written and were in circulation, but had no Bible of their own. The Gentile church quickly adopted the Jewish scripture as Christian scripture and began using it in Christian worship. And eventually they gave it a new name. What they started calling it was the Old Covenant. The entire volume, the law, the prophets, the history books, the books of poetry like Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Job, all of that. The whole volume was called the Old Covenant. And then when Latin gave way, or when Greek gave way to Latin, they started using a different term. They started using the term Testament. And then it became the Old Testament. Now, why old? Because Gentile Christians recognized that God, through Christ, had done something new. That God had fulfilled the Old Testament promises to Israel and was establishing a new covenant with the nation and with the nations of the world. A covenant that Jesus would say would be instituted and inaugurated in his blood. And we'll talk about that next time. But up to this point in history, there's still no Bible. There's Jewish text, some accounts of Jesus' life, some correspondence by a very famous church planter named Paul to his Gentile congregations around the Mediterranean rim, and a few letters that we have from the apostles to different churches. And that's where we pick it up next time as we watch the church, and this is huge. How do they wrestle with bringing the old covenant? How do you deal with the old covenant when there's a new one that Jesus established? How do we take what's important out of this that applies to us and recognize that some of this was just the means to an end to get us to where we are? And we'll tackle that next time, but I want to share this one thing before we go. This Bible was a gift to me on my 16th birthday, which was 8 years ago. And that joke gets funnier every year. And no, this was almost 30 years ago. I got this Bible, and from my friend Steve Sue. And if you've been around Calvary, you know I've talked about my friend Steve. And Steve and his family came to America from South Korea, and he had a given name, but part of how his family assimilated into American culture was by taking a name. He was watching TV, saw a guy named Steve, and said, "I like that." So Steve and I went to high school together, and Steve became a Christian when we were in the 9th grade together. But Steve was also the only 9th grader with a car. What I realized later on is I don't think Steve had a driver's license. I just think Steve had a car. And so anyway, so he would give anybody a ride home, but there was a catch. The catch was that he would talk to you about Jesus the whole way there to your house. And so all the time, sometimes he would say, "Hey, Bob, you want to ride home? I'm like, you going to talk to me about Jesus the whole way home?" He's like, "Yep." I'm like, "I'll walk." And I'd walk the 2 miles to my house rather than hear some guy preach the gospel to me. Well, anyway, he, on my 16th birthday, he's like, "Come on, let me give you a ride home. It's your birthday." So I'm like, "All right." I'm like, "Please, but just throttle it back." He's like, "Let's just, we'll just talk about whatever." So we talk about just whatever you talk about when you're 16. And as I'm getting out of the car, he pulls up to my house. As I'm getting out, he gives me this Bible, but it's wrapped. Just open it. And I open it. I'm like, "Wow, Steve, thank you." And I'm thinking, what in the world am I going to do with the Bible? And because I don't read it. I respected the Bible because I grew up respecting the Bible, but I didn't think the Bible was anything that was relevant to me. And this was his inscription. And he says this. He says, "Bob, I'm praying that out of the 66 books of the Bible, you will find only one thing: Jesus Christ, your friend, Steve." And yeah. Now I want to tell you 2 things. One that has nothing to do with this, and one that has everything to do with this. The first thing I want to tell you is I've had this Bible for about 30 years. This October will be 30 years. And we've had many offices over almost 19 years at Calvary, and this Bible is never more than 5 feet away from me. I keep it close to me for no other reason than this, to me, this represents a guy who was trying to reach me and I wasn't there yet. And it wouldn't be another 3 years before I became a Christian. It wasn't until I started college that I would become a Christian. And I see this Bible all the time. And the thing that it reminds me of is that, listen, every prayer that you pray, every conversation that you have, every seed that you plant, listen, it's not in vain. We just don't know how far we are with the people that we love that maybe aren't there yet. And what we want to do is share what we know, what we believe, to do it in a gentle and respectful way so that when they are ready, that we're the one that they come to talk to. And this Bible, listen, is the reminder to me over 3 decades that I wasn't looking for him, but God was looking for me. And so, anyway, it struck me this week as I read that little inscription that Steve's prayer and God's desire were the same. Because when the old covenant is doing its job, it leads us on an amazing journey to the fulfillment of God's promises in the person of Jesus Christ. That it's gritty and it's rough and it's confusing sometimes because we're 3,500 years away and we're half a world away, and sometimes it's easy to misunderstand. But when we're reading the Old Covenant correctly, when we're reading the Hebrew Scriptures correctly, it points us to the person who is the fulfillment of all the promises that we read about. And the Old Covenant ends where the story of the New Covenant begins. To a manger in Bethlehem, when God didn't sit back and watch life on earth happen. He entered the fray and gave us a picture. The picture of God that we've been looking for. He entered life here on earth in the same way he wants to enter your life and mine, to show us who God is and show us that there's a better way. Let's pray together. Lord, we're grateful that even when we aren't looking for you, you're looking for us. So I pray that you would do a work in each and every one of us, that we would know you better. Help us to recognize this amazing story that leads us to the most amazing person when you showed up and lived the life that's an example to follow and died the kind of death that would pay for what we've done, and you rose again, showing that there's nothing that you can't conquer. So I pray that you would do that work in us today. And we pray it in Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen. Amen.
Thanks for watching this week's message. Make sure to click the subscribe button below to stay up to date with all the things happening here at Calvary. God bless you.